Right now, in the waters near Venezuela, one of the largest U.S. military deployments in decades is underway. Aircraft carriers are active. Surveillance systems are running non-stop. Oil tankers are being watched, delayed, and pressured. Governments are exchanging accusations. Economies are shaking. And millions of lives are being affected without a single vote being cast. This is not a breaking news moment that will disappear tomorrow. This is a slow-moving crisis with consequences that could last for years. Most people are not paying attention. Most headlines are oversimplifying it. But what is happening between the United States and Venezuela right now matters not just for these two countries, but for the entire region. Because this is no longer just about politics. It is about power. It is about control of resources. It is about military pressure without a formal war. And it is about how close the world can move toward conflict without officially calling it one. If this situation escalates, history will look back at this moment and ask a difficult question. Why didn't we take it seriously when the warning signs were already there? Before opinions, before ideology, before blame, we need understanding. And that's exactly what this video is about. For decades, relations between the United States and Venezuela have been shaped by distrust. Venezuela, rich in oil but politically divided, has often seen U.S. involvement as interference. The United States, on the other hand, has long viewed Venezuela's leadership as authoritarian, corrupt, and destabilizing for the region. These opposing views did not appear overnight. They developed slowly, over years of failed diplomacy, economic pressure, and political confrontation. Sanctions became the main weapon. The United States targeted Venezuelan officials, state institutions, and especially the oil sector, the backbone of Venezuela's economy. These sanctions were meant to weaken the government, but they also deeply affected ordinary people. Inflation rose. Jobs disappeared. Public services collapsed. Millions of Venezuelans left their homes, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Yet, despite all this pressure, the Venezuelan government survived, and that survival changed the strategy. By 2025, the conflict entered a new phase. The United States announced expanded military operations in the Caribbean region, officially aimed at counter-narcotics efforts. On paper, the mission sounded familiar, stopping drug trafficking routes that run through South America and the Caribbean. But in reality, the scale of the deployment raised eyebrows across the world. This was not routine patrol activity. This was the largest U.S. military presence near Venezuela in decades. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, surveillance aircraft, and thousands of troops were positioned within reach of Venezuelan waters. Washington insisted the mission was legal, defensive, and focused on crime. Caracas saw it very differently. Venezuelan leaders called it intimidation. They accused the United States of preparing the ground for direct intervention. And once again, fear entered the conversation. Then came the strikes. Us. Forces began targeting vessels accused of being involved in drug trafficking. Some were intercepted. Others were destroyed. Official statements described these operations as necessary and precise. But reports soon emerged of rising death tolls and unclear intelligence. Critics asked hard questions. Who was being targeted? Under what authority? And where was the line between law enforcement and warfare? For many observers, this was a turning point. Because once military force is used repeatedly, even under limited justifications, escalation becomes easier and restraint becomes harder. At the same time, another pressure point was activated. Oil. Venezuela's oil is not just a resource. It is leverage. It is survival. It is power. And when the United States moved to block sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers, the message was clear. Economic warfare was intensifying. Oil tankers were delayed. Routes were disrupted. Insurance companies hesitated. Buyers backed away. Venezuela responded by accusing the United States of piracy and illegal aggression. Despite the pressure, some shipments still made their way to international partners, especially China. But every shipment carried risk, and every delay tightened the economic noose. Inside Venezuela, the consequences were immediate. Inflation surged again. The national currency weakened further. Food prices rose. Medicine became harder to find. For ordinary families, geopolitics was no longer a distant concept, it was something felt at the dinner table. Meanwhile, the world was watching. Latin America found itself divided. Some governments criticized U.S. military actions and called for dialogue. Others supported stronger pressure on Venezuela's leadership. Regional unity fractured under the weight of ideology, economic interests, and historical memory. At international forums, Venezuela accused the United States of threatening regional peace. The United States defended its actions as necessary for security and stability. Both sides spoke the language of legality. Both sides claimed moral ground, but neither side backed down. Beyond governments and militaries, there is another side to this crisis, the human side. In Venezuela, families continue to live with uncertainty. Parents worry about food. Young people worry about their future. Many have already left. Many more are considering it. Migration is not a political statement for them. It is survival. In neighboring countries, migrants face discrimination, economic hardship, and legal uncertainty. In the United States, Venezuelan migrants become part of political debates about borders, asylum, and national identity. The crisis travels with them, crossing borders just as easily as oil tankers and warships. As tensions rise, one question becomes unavoidable. Is this heading toward open conflict? Most experts agree that neither side wants full-scale war. The costs would be enormous. The consequences unpredictable. But history shows that wars do not always begin with intention. They begin with miscalculations, misunderstandings, and moments when pride outweighs patience. One wrong move at sea. One misinterpreted radar signal. One political decision made under pressure. And suddenly, escalation becomes reality. The United States insists its actions are about law enforcement and regional security. Venezuela insists they are about control and regime change. Between these two narratives lies a dangerous gap, one filled with suspicion and resentment. Diplomacy still exists. Back-channel talks continue. International mediators quietly attempt to lower tensions. But diplomacy works best when both sides believe compromise is possible. Right now, compromise looks politically risky for everyone involved. And so, the standoff continues. This crisis is not just about two countries. It is about the future of power in the Western Hemisphere. It is about whether sanctions can truly force political change. It is about whether military pressure deters instability or creates it. And most importantly, it is about whether ordinary people must always pay the price for political battles they did not choose. The sea remains calm for now. The ships remain in position. The oil continues to flow, slowly and under watch. But the question remains unanswered. How close are we to the edge? The sea, for now, remains calm. But calm does not mean safe, because what's unfolding between the United States and Venezuela isn't a traditional war. There are no official declarations, no invading armies, and no formal battlefields. Instead, this is pressure without war, a modern form of confrontation where power is applied quietly, constantly, and deliberately. Military presence replaces invasion. Sanctions replace bombs. Economic strangulation replaces occupation. And the effects can be just as devastating. From Washington's perspective, the strategy is clear. Officials argue that Venezuela has become a hub for criminal networks, corruption, and instability. They frame their actions as necessary to protect regional security and international law. Counter-narcotics operations, they say, are not acts of aggression. They are enforcement. But from Caracas, the message is equally clear. Venezuelan leaders describe these same actions as threats to sovereignty. They argue that drug enforcement is being used as a cover for political pressure. To them, This isn't law enforcement, it's coercion. And caught between these two narratives lies a dangerous reality. Both sides believe they are justified. History tells us that when justification replaces dialogue, escalation becomes much easier. That is why the military presence matters so much. Because large deployments are not neutral. They send signals. They create tension. They reduce the room for error. And in regions already shaped by a long memory of colonialism and intervention, this kind of symbolism carries enormous weight. To many in Latin America, U.S. warships near Venezuela don't feel abstract, they feel familiar. As the military pressure increased, political pressure followed closely behind. Inside the United States, debates began quietly but intensely. Some lawmakers started questioning the scope of executive power. Others argued that strong action was long overdue. Discussions about war power surfaced, not because war had begun, but because the line between enforcement and outright conflict was becoming blurrier by the day. When legislative efforts to limit military authority failed, critics warned that oversight was weakening. Supporters of the strategy responded that flexibility was necessary in a dangerous world. Once again, there was no consensus-only momentum. Meanwhile, Venezuela's international position grew more and more complicated. Years of sanctions and political isolation had already weakened its alliances. Some of its traditional regional partners stepped back, unwilling to be drawn into a direct confrontation with Washington. Others called for mediation, worried that the instability could spill across their own borders. But Venezuela was not completely alone. It leaned on relationships with countries willing to challenge, influence nations that saw a strategic value in resisting American pressure. These partnerships didn't solve Venezuela's problems, but they did provide some breathing space. And in the world of geopolitics, breathing space can sometimes be just enough to survive. While governments maneuvered on the global stage, it was ordinary people who carried the weight. Inside Venezuela, daily life continued under a constant strain. Prices would change overnight. Salaries lost their value before they could even be spent. Hospitals struggled to keep their doors open. Schools had to adapt with fewer and fewer resources. Families adjusted their expectations again and again, learning to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. For many Venezuelans, the crisis was no longer shocking. It was exhausting. And exhaustion changes people. It pushes them to leave. It pushes them to accept risks they never would have before. It pushes them to lose faith not only in their governments, but in the future itself. Migration became both a symptom and a consequence of this pressure. Millions had already crossed borders in search of stability. Each new escalation made that choice feel more urgent. Neighboring countries absorbed the impact, stretching their social services and fueling difficult political debates of their own. In distant capitals, migration numbers appeared as cold, hard statistics. But on the ground, they appeared as families walking with backpacks, children holding documents, and parents making impossible decisions. This is what pressure looks like when it reaches human lives. As the economic warfare tightened, oil remained at the center of everything. Venezuela's oil industry, once one of the strongest in the world, had already been severely damaged by mismanagement, sanctions, and a lack of investment. The added pressure on tankers and exports made any kind of recovery even harder. Every blocked shipment meant lost revenue for the state. Every delayed payment meant fewer resources for an already struggling population. Supporters of the sanctions argued that the responsibility for this pain lay with the Venezuelan government. Critics argued that the pain was being felt far from presidential offices, in the homes of ordinary people. Both claims carried a degree of truth, and that is what made the situation so morally complex. International law entered the conversation more loudly. Venezuela accused the United States of violating maritime norms and acting far beyond its legal authority. The United States responded by emphasizing national security, international cooperation, and existing legal frameworks for its actions. But international law, much like power, often depends on who is enforcing it. and enforcement without trust only creates more resistance. As the weeks passed, the crisis settled into a tense, predictable rhythm. There were no dramatic explosions, no formal negotiations, just constant pressure, military, economic, diplomatic, applied, steadily, patiently, and very publicly. This is how so many modern conflicts unfold. Not in sudden chaos, but in a slow, grinding erosion. And yet, beneath the surface of this new normal, anxiety was growing. Military analysts warned of the risk of accidental escalation. Diplomats warned of the danger of miscalculation. Economists warned of a deeper economic collapse. Humanitarian groups warned of long-term damage that would outlast any political victory. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing. Once this situation spirals out of control, controlling it again becomes much, much harder. So the question returned, again and again. How much pressure is too much? How close is too close? And at what point does deterrence turn into provocation? The world has seen this pattern before. In other regions, in other decades. Power applied gradually, justified carefully, until one single moment breaks the delicate balance. No one knows what that moment will be, but everyone knows it exists. For now, leaders continue to speak in measured tones. Official statements are carefully calibrated. Words like war are deliberately avoided. But avoidance does not equal absence. Simply means the conflict has learned to hide behind language. And while language may delay a confrontation, it doesn't erase the underlying tension. This is where the story stands now. Not at peace. Not at war. But suspended somewhere between restraint and escalation, between diplomacy and dominance, between survival and collapse. Before we dive in, let's be perfectly clear about one thing. This video is based on verified reporting from international news agencies, official government statements, economic data, and expert analysis. It isn't here to promote any government, ideology, or political agenda. It doesn't predict war, nor does it claim to have any secret information. Our purpose is simple: to explain what is happening, why it matters, and how it affects real people beyond the slogans and headlines. As the pressure between the United States and Venezuela continues to build, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This crisis is not frozen, it's evolving. Every single military deployment, every new sanction, every intercepted shipment slightly shifts the balance of power. None of these actions exist in a vacuum. Each one sends a message not just to Venezuela, but to the entire world. To allies, it signals resolve. To rivals, it signals reach. To smaller nations, it's a stark reminder of how power is exercised on the global stage. And for ordinary people caught in the middle, it just signals uncertainty. At the very heart of this conflict is oil. It's the central nerve. When oil revenues fall, everything else weakens: public services, infrastructure, salaries, and social stability. Years of sanctions and mismanagement have already devastated this system. Continued pressure makes any kind of recovery incredibly difficult. For the United States, oil represents leverage. By controlling access to global markets, insurance, and shipping routes, it can apply immense pressure without a direct military occupation. It's a form of influence that's applied quietly, but with crushing effectiveness. This is why you hear so much about oil tankers. They aren't just ships, they're floating symbols of survival on one side and control on the other. As Venezuelan exports struggle, the entire global energy market watches closely. Any disruption, even a regional one, creates ripple effects. Prices shift. Supply chains have to adjust. Political calculations change. What begins as a dispute between two countries slowly starts to touch consumers thousands of miles away at the gas pump. This is how modern conflicts spread, not always by crossing borders, but by flowing through interconnected systems. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts are still happening, mostly behind closed doors. Public statements from both sides remain firm and unyielding, but quieter conversations are trying to prevent a full-blown escalation. International organizations are urging restraint. Mediators are attempting to keep the lines of communication alive. But diplomacy faces a massive obstacle: a total lack of trust. Trust erodes when pressure replaces dialogue. Trust disappears when each side questions the other's intentions. And once trust is gone, even a potential compromise can be seen as a sign of weakness. This is the fragile, high-stakes environment where life-and-death decisions are now being made. One of the most dangerous aspects of this entire situation is the risk of miscalculation. History is filled with examples of major conflicts that didn't start with a deliberate choice for war. They began with accidents. A misunderstood military maneuver, a radar signal that was read incorrectly, a political leader feeling forced to respond quickly because of public pressure. In heavily militarized zones like this, mistakes travel fast. The margin for error becomes razor-thin. At the same time, the humanitarian dimension of this crisis continues to deepen. Economic pressure isn't just an abstract concept on a chart. It moves quickly into the reality of daily life. It determines whether grocery store shelves are stocked, whether hospitals can function, whether families can even plan for the future. It shapes the heartbreaking decisions that lead to migration. It affects education, health, and the very fabric of society. No matter how justified a strategy might appear on paper, its consequences are always felt first and hardest by those with the least amount of power. This isn't an argument. It's an observable, tragic reality. For the Venezuelans who have chosen to remain in their country, resilience has become a way of life. Communities adapt. Informal economies replace broken official ones. People find ways to help each other survive. But resilience has its limits. No society can endure this kind of constant, grinding pressure forever without suffering long-term, generational damage. For the millions of Venezuelans who have left, the journey doesn't end when they cross the border. They face a whole new set of challenges: legal uncertainty, economic hardship, and cultural displacement. The crisis follows them, reshaped but completely unresolved. Back in Washington, policymakers continue to frame their actions as necessary and carefully measured. In Caracas, leaders frame their resistance as a matter of national defense and sovereignty. Both sides speak the language of responsibility. But what responsibility looks like depends entirely on where you stand. And it's in that gap, that difference in perspective, where conflict grows and festers. So, where does all of this lead? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. There are paths that could lead to war de-escalation. There are paths that could lead to a prolonged, simmering standoff that lasts for years. And there are paths that could lead to a sudden, catastrophic crisis. The direction this takes will depend on choices that have not yet been made or, at least, have not yet been revealed to the public. What is clear is that the current situation, the status quo, is not stable. Pressure can be sustained for a time, but it can never replace a real resolution. Eventually, something has to give, either a turn toward dialogue or a slide toward confrontation. This is precisely why paying attention matters. Not because war is inevitable, but because ignoring the warning signs has never prevented a conflict. It only delays our understanding of it. The situation between the United States and Venezuela is a powerful reminder of how power operates in the modern world, not always loudly, but persistently. Not always with overt violence, but relentlessly. And its heaviest costs are often paid by people who are far away from the halls of power. It forces us to ask some very difficult questions. Can sanctions create political change without destroying entire societies? Can military pressure deter instability without accidentally provoking it? And can diplomacy possibly survive when trust has been eroded for years? These questions don't have simple answers, but they deserve our serious attention. As this story continues to unfold, one thing remains certain: The outcome will not be decided by rhetoric or angry speeches alone. It will be shaped by patience, restraint, cold calculation, and by the willingness of leaders to see beyond their own immediate advantage. Because once escalation crosses a certain point, reversing it becomes exponentially more difficult. If you value informed discussion over noise and understanding over outrage, then this is where your role matters. Share this story, question it, discuss it with others. Stay engaged, because global events don't just belong to governments and generals. They belong to every single person whose life is shaped by their consequences. The ships are still at sea. The oil is still moving. The pressure remains. And the world is watching quietly, closely, and very, very cautiously. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. Stay informed.